All right. Thank you, Krista, for joining me here. And the last time, or the first time, and the last time I met you was in Plum Village. We had lunch together. And what was interesting about that lunch was I was kind of watching you. It's sort of like when you go to lunch with a nutritionist, what they're going to put on their plate. I was watching you. how does how does Krista Tippett approach conversation, right? This is Krista Tippett in the wild. And I did notice a few things. I did notice a few things about you, the intentionality of that you bring to your interactions.
Mm.
And actually, during that lunch, we had two people sit with us. I don't know if you remember this, but we had,
I do, yeah.
yeah,
I remember there was a lot going on.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What do you remember about it?
Well, I feel like, yeah, it was kind of this, we were sitting together, other people joined. I can't, had we, there'd been some activities. I don't know. And well, you were staying in that community, right? But
Yeah.
in Lower Hamlet, or you were staying nearby. Is that right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I just remember you and I had been planning to talk, and then there kept being things that pulled us away.
Yes. Yes. Well, but what I observed about you was the first person that came to sit with us was from the biomimicry 3.0, and how
Yes.
excited you were about biomimicry, which got
Yeah.
me really into it afterwards. I actually interviewed someone from that afterwards,
Well,
but
good.
how
Yes.
how curious and excited you were. But what
Yeah.
actually really struck me was when we had a student come up to us, and I remember this. She had started the On Being podcast
That's right.
club at her
Yeah,
university,
that's right.
and how much attention you gave her. That
Oh,
you just, you walked with her, you talked with her. So it said a little bit about you
mm,
in terms of where your interests are, but also how you show up. As you described, we show up, we choose the raw materials of words, presence, and the energy of our bodies when we
mm,
that we bring to our interactions.
yeah.
So yeah, so
Oh,
hopefully we can do that today with
okay.
each other. Yeah. Uh, how was Plum Village for you? What surprised you about it?
Well, I interviewed Thich Nhat Hanh, uh, 22 years ago, and I was much younger. My project was really embryonic, and of course, he was in the world, and he had a lot of vitality. Um, I guess he was 60, but it was I've had many wonderful conversations with extraordinary people, but this one, he was an absolutely stunning, extraordinary being. And it was a formative experience, that conversation with him. And then across the years, I had never been to Plum Village, but I had always felt like I had a relationship with them, through the conversation with him. And in fact, the young abbot now, who I just adore, was actually sitting at Ty's feet in that room. They were in the States doing a retreat in Wisconsin. And so he is actually a physical thread, from
Mm.
that experience I had, and then into the present day of this community that had this powerful spiritual leader, and I feel has really kept the lineage alive. Um, so it was all of that, there was a lot of time where I had felt like I'd known them, but now I was really present with them. So it was big.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I observed you one other way at that retreat, which was you came up right up to the front of the meditation hall to listen to the Dharma talk. I think it was with Brother Fapu. And you lay down, the lying down position for meditation, which is one of
Yeah.
my favorite. There's four noble positions to sit in meditation, right? Standing, walking, sitting, and lying.
Yeah.
And I love the permission, that just the permission it seemed to really take that rest
Mhm.
in that space and absorb and take in. So, what a beautiful full circle for you to
Yeah.
come back there and now be
Yeah.
at the feet of Brother Fapu. Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your work in terms of this sort of balance that you're bringing to the struggle, the crises, the catastrophes that we tend to focus on so much. And the angle that I was listening this morning to an interview you did with Ross Gay,
Yeah.
and he's an essayist, and I could listen to that interview repeatedly over and over again. It was about
Yes.
delight, and it seems like there's a little bit of energy to you of focusing on the joy, the delight, the sort of balancing out the catastrophes of our world by where we're placing our attention.
Yeah. Yes. And I want to say also that that is something I've come to. It was a hard one. I wasn't always like this. um, uh, Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet, the 20th century poet, is a big, important thinker and kind of companion to me across time and space. And he was very much about, leaning into what he called the dark hours of my being. And, I've always, I think in some ways that's quite countercultural in American life, to also honor the fact that life, you know, um, has hardness in it, and then really be present to this very strange, um, and intriguing and good fact that uh, the hard places are often where we grow and where we stretch. So I think when I was younger, I was more um, actively interested in that. And also, those were years of building my work and raising my children and never quite having enough time or energy for any of it. Or, always wondering if I was doing any of it well. And in some ways you could argue that on balance the world has become a harder place for more people. Um, there are certainly uh, a lot of fracture points and outright wars and conflagrations and so much uncertainty. Um, but even as I've been present to that in these years, and also am really, really aware that all the things that are breaking have been breaking for a long time. And I think that is important to bear in mind. Um, I've also noticed, because I've increasingly spent more time with younger people, that there's something happening, especially in the world of people working on really difficult front lines, activists, as well as poets and, people I call social creatives. And it is this that I hear this chorus of people insisting that joy, like using this word joy a lot, and then you have somebody like
Mhm.
Ross Gay comes along, who writes this book called The Book of Delights. And he takes as his spiritual practice every day for a year, attending to delight. And actually it's not a polar opposite of what I you know what I said a minute ago about leaning into the darkness, because what he and people like Adrienne Murray Brown, and I just hear many, many people saying, is that our capacity to take delight whenever and wherever we can find it, to seize joy, that this is part of our strength. This is resistance, right? And this is also sustenance for the long work ahead of being healing forces in this world, that is so troubled. So, just like you mentioned, I was really reflecting on Ross, but it's really this whole evolution for me. And I think that I've experienced in a lot of people.
Mhm. And the way in which we balance both, I mean, sort of the both and of it is, I think interesting to us. Sometimes we feel guilty about taking in the delights, especially right now when there's so much that is falling apart. But in some ways, it's what gives us the resources to be able to do the work that we do. And I've been working a bit with Alyssa Epple on her climate resilience project, and
Yes.
this is exactly what we sort of front load these students with, like front load
Yes.
them with the inner resources, but also the collective resources, which is something that you've written a bit about, more sort of the community aspect of resilience. That I think there's, especially in psychology, there's so much of a focus on the individual resilience
Yes.
factors. But when you
Yes.
start to go into communities and see the resources that are in the interactions, sort of that collective
Mhm.
resilience, you write, the
Mhm.
question of what it means to be human is now now inextricable from the question of who we are to each other.
Mhm.
That interbeing, as Ty would call it, that he's
Yes.
written and spoken a lot about, is now,
Yeah.
I think, coming to the surface more than ever in terms of our community resilience. That's just as vital.
Yes, I think it just look, one of the things, I mean, biomimicry is something that you and I have both, found this interest in, and we're learning so much about the natural world everywhere we turn and how vitality functions, and we're learning that, this idea that I am an individual, of course, on some level, that's true. I'm an individual. And on other levels, it's just a fiction, right? I mean, my body even has maybe more microbial cells at this moment than it has human cells. And our lives, in many ways, we've structured the world against this, but the truth is that we are vulnerable to each other. We are affecting, others close by and far away in every moment. We may function as a collective dysfunctionally, but we are a collective. And so that, there's that. And then I think if we look at any of these really, meaningful existential challenges that are really in front of our whole species in this century, whether it is the ecological crisis, which really is, I think, the foundational one and the most existential, that really separates our generation in time from others, but also, the calling that we have to really grapple with race and with what making our economy work for human beings, or how to heal politics, like what democracy is going to be. um all of those things, I think, require us not just to be strong individuals, but to grow up our relationship, not only to other human beings across difference, but to all of life. And Ty really was so prophetic or he understood that, right? I mean, you could say that it's an ancient reality that has come into relief in modern times, but it's not just other human beings. It's the planet, it's the ground we stand on and the air we breathe. And if we don't really reckon with that and reframe our relationships all around, we might survive the century, but I don't think we flourish.
Mhm. I've been finding myself wanting to pull way back in to community at the, like, who can I touch across the road from me
Yeah.
level. Because I
Yeah.
think, during the pandemic and COVID, so many of us went global. Now,
Yeah.
wow, we were starting to have all these interactions with people from all over the world, and we felt that
Yeah.
global community aspect of, which was really, I think, rad to have that
Yeah.
level of interconnection. And then we also, I think, are missing that fabric of, I can touch your shoulder, I can bring you a pie, I can, whatever it is, that ways in which I can dance with you, I can move with you, I can walk with you,
Yeah.
that do contribute to our feelings of safety. And it's sort of like, if my house floods, who has the shovel to help dig me out of the mud kind of situation, which is very much more a reality than ever, and will continue to be an increasing reality with these um, shifts in terms of our climate. How does that community look like for you? Because you are so international. Where do you find community resilience?
Yeah. Well, there's kind of a paradox in this. It isn't there. I mean, I, I'm also feeling right now in these months that it's just so. urgent and also such a relief. And it's part of the way we're going to get grounded to sanity and even to our own agency is by really knowing and seeing and moving and feeling, moving in and feeling the world that we can see and touch.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that, because that's, you know, again, we are informed, like, you know, the information overload is almost, it bombards us, right? It almost, it paralyzes us. It's too much. We can't take it in. And so much of it is, in fact, desperate. And we feel we have all kinds of compassionate reactions, but there is absolutely nothing we can do. And I think part of the antidote to that is really attending to the places where we can not only just even be present with our attention and with our physicality, but can have us enough of a proximity of understanding of where we might be useful, you know, where our presence can matter. So it's a creature comfort, but I think that is not to be underestimated in its power. But it's also really, it's going to be really our place to be plugged in to know how we can most meaningfully engage.
Mm-hmm. What are those weak ties that are really truly our strong ties that we think are just weak ties, but then we realize how
Yeah.
strong they are when we need them or when we feel compelled to contribute to them. You know,
Yeah,
we
the
notice
other
them.
thing I think, you know, connected to what about the delight and joy
Mm-hmm.
conversation is it's still a tall order to say, be joyful, you know, right now. Like, but know when you can be joyful. Take delight. Um, it's a tall order to say, you know, hope and curiosity are moral muscles. And so you should flex your hope and curiosity in a time like this. Like that is literally hard. And um many of us are not standing on very, you know, the ground beneath us seems to be shaking and different. Some of us are more vulnerable than others. And when we're vulnerable, when we're uncertain, you know, and you know this in your work, like, you know, we literally can't rise to our higher cognitive faculties, and we may not be able to feel or claim something like hope or curiosity or joy. And I really want to say that also, um, you know, we've individualized everything in this culture. So I think like those things I think of as virtues, those experiences of hope and curiosity and even, you know, a kind of fierce joy are virtues, but they've never been something that heroic individuals were supposed to carry alone, right? They're supposed to be cultivated and held in community. And I think in a time like this, however it is that we want to be in the world, we need to surround ourselves with other people who are holding that same aspiration. And none of us is going to be able to be that perfectly on any given day or maybe for long stretches of time. And so we also surround ourselves with people or get ourselves into communal situations where other people can be joyful on days we can't, right? Or who can carry hope when we can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's sort of the benefits of community, and that our community or our community resources can be even something like your podcast on being. Like I could imagine if I was having a really bad day, plugging that in my ears, that
Yeah.
especially that episode uh, on Delight with Ross Gay, plugging that in my ears and letting him say it if I can't think it myself, right?
Yeah.
Or the
Yeah.
communities that we can reach out to with a phone call or a text or messaging,
Mhm.
then we can also be that source of hope for others. And
Yes.
that's where I think that's where, you know, Ty would talk about the right hand and the left hand of the body, right? And in compare, you know, us in terms of our larger community body, that we can be the right hand to a left hand in support
Oh,
of
it's
each other.
lovely. I hadn't heard that. I don't know that I remember that teaching. What did he
Yeah.
say?
Well, he
That,
would talk about the right hand never criticizes the left hand or tells the left hand that they should do a better job, or you know that
yeah.
they actually work together. And Actually, when he had a stroke, Brother Papu would tell this story about after his stroke, how his whole right side of his body was paralyzed. You know, the part of his body he used to write or paint his calligraphy, and how
Yeah.
he held that right arm with his left hand, and he pulled his hand up to his cheek, and he touched his own cheek. You know, using his left hand to support his right arm, which
Mhm.
couldn't move. And that when we expand that, we can do that with our physical bodies, right? But when we expand that to a community, that sometimes one member of the community is needing to support another member, but it changes, it
Yes,
shifts, and
exactly.
and
Yeah.
that trust that it will shift and change. That sometimes you'll be strong in some areas or have hope and then hold that for others, and then sometimes you won't, and you'll need to lean on others for that type of support. But we have to get out of that individualized, we're separate mentality to believe
Yeah.
that, to use it.
That's
Mhm.
wonderful. Yeah.
So, what does that look like? I guess one thing that I think I struggle with is if we're in a position of believing in that, you know, believing in our interconnection, and then there's a whole movement towards individualism or towards separateness, right? Towards I'm in it for myself.
Yeah.
How do you work with that type of energy?
Well, I mean, that's, that's hard, right? Because it's like a collective hallucination, you know?
Mhm.
And I come from this culture too. So, um, I I I think, um, part of the work is just naming this truth even for myself, right? Just and kind of having the conversation. Um, Separation is not our essential nature, and it does not give us life. Um, and then I think, this matter of what you and I also were touching on of finding, but again, that feeling of the vigor of the separation, of the, extent of it, in the wider world, in our country, politically, um, it can feel overwhelming. And it's true that right in this moment, as I'm sitting here speaking with you, I'm not doing anything to affect that. And even after we finish speaking, I don't know how to affect that at a macro level, right? This is, again, this is a story we've walked into, and it's going to take time walking through it and out of it and to a beyond of it. But I think whoever we are, whatever that world is that we want to see that we're not living in now, the only way to start is close to home, is in what we can touch, what we can do, what we know. The world we know close to home is where we have the right kind of intelligence and sensitivity to the details of what's going on. I mean, part of the story of our country and the world and the West, the last 50, 100 years has been a lot of, going far away to do good, in other places, kind of according to our vision of what that would look like, and actually being very disruptive and destructive.
Mhm.
Right. And so, or, us having kind of heroic visions of what we could be far, far away, and not what we can be close to home, not what we can model and what we can actually live, as opposed to, merely kind of ideate. Um, and now in this world, I think that what we are given is what is in front of our eyes and what we can touch with our hands. And some of us, depending on what our roles are. I mean, with my work, I can actually touch people far away, with my voice, right? And um, there are people who also work at high levels of policy or media. But each of us, I think, has to really examine, like, what are those raw materials that we've been given, that we have at this moment in our lives, which of course um, evolves and changes across the span of a life. And I think, I do think something important to me is, it's not just the question we need to be asking is not just what can I do, but not just what to do, but what is the quality of my presence in this world and to other people for whom I am the person in the world that they can see and touch, right? And I believe when I look at our world of such rupture um, and uncertainty that really is manifesting as fear, and a lot of uncertainty that is painful, and a lot of the ground falling, shifting beneath people's feet. And the ecological crisis, which I actually think we're all feeling in our bodies, whether we know it or not, below the level of consciousness. So I actually think, and this too is really counterintuitive, because Americans are such can-do people, and the question we ask is, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? But I think there is real heft for any of us right now. I think part of the work is knowing what it is to get grounded in our bodies, in space and time, in place and community, and cultivate that quality of presence we want to have to others, and to the hardness. But some of that is work we have to do inside ourselves before we can actually be as we want to be in the face of that hardness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense for me as a psychologist. Is what that's where I have agency, is how I show up
Yeah.
with the client, right? And then how that
Yes.
client may show up with when they walk into their workplace or when they walk into their home. And we have these big, this is also sort of the American dream, right? We have these big ideals and dreams around how we're going to change the world or change our life or,
Yes.
whatever. That
Yes.
actually, it's just in coming back to Thich Nhat Hanh, probably the interaction with him was so powerful, less because of what he said, but in my experience of being in his presence, it's how he was.
His presence.
His
That's right.
presence. It's how he picked up a cup of tea with both hands and stopped
Yes.
everything to take a sip. It would take a really long time to take
Yeah.
a sip. How he walked across a room, and it wasn't any show that he was putting on. He was just the
No.
living embodiment of peace, right? And then we're all moved
Yes.
by it, right? And he took that peace into the streets of, New York. He'd protest by slowing way down and walking really slowly through a crowd. And that was his way he protested, right? So I do think we don't give enough credence to that, to the ways in which we're interacting with somebody in a casual casual interaction that could have a huge impact on the rest of their day, positive or negative. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
For me, his presence, what I just felt, so it was just almost shocking in a lovely way, was how he just embodied a quality of power. I mean, he was a very powerful, intense person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also just this incredible tenderness at the same time, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And it was bodily, and it was in how he spoke, and it was in how he looked at you. And it was also, you could see this visible effect of other people entering the physical space with him, that this presence had on them.
Yeah. In the same way that, we think about the ecological crisis, if you take children into nature and you watch how they interact with
Yeah.
nature, and you really are, aware of how they interact, looking at a bug or pausing to, follow a little stream, that could teach us, right? So there's the presence that we bring to our interactions, but that also what we choose to observe and where we place our attention in other people's presence, and who are we putting that attention on? Who are we strengthening our mind around? Like Ty would talk about, what seeds are we watering in our own mind with our
Yeah.
attention? And when we're in social media and the news and we're just filling it with all of
Yeah.
this threat, it
Yeah.
changes our whole nervous systems. And
Yes.
then we're transmitting that nervous system to each other in how we're driving or how we're walking or how we're talking. So there is a shift there as well. That could be, another way, another tool to use is where you're placing your attention.
Yes, and yeah, and I think some of us, and I would definitely speak for myself, earlier in my life, we need to be convinced that it's for different reasons, that it's okay, that it's actually that I am actually strengthening and working on how I'm going to be present to the world if I spend some time working on myself, right? And that's not optional, that's not a luxury, that in fact is part of the work. It doesn't, I don't know, that it doesn't come naturally, or we're not educated for that to come naturally. I think about talking to a conversation I had with Isabel Wilkerson a long time ago, about who did all the work on really kind of revealing, writing the history of the Great Migration of 6 million African Americans in the mid 20th century, that really hadn't been told, of people, as who she says had to leave the South, immigrate from one part of their country to another in order to feel like a citizen. And she talked about, all the advance that was made in the 60s and 70s around matters of race, but how what we changed a lot of laws then, and that was significant, right? I mean, it was very important work, but there was really this kind of American faith, I think, even on the part of the civil rights leaders, in changing the law. If you change the laws, you change the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Change the structures, you change the world. But what Isabel says is, we changed the laws, but we didn't change ourselves. And that's when even tectonic kind of social change becomes enduring, becomes transformation, as opposed to social change that can be reversed and undone and lived beyond. This is really serious, what we're talking about. This inner work is really serious. It's
Yeah.
worth our time.
Mhm. It's serious, worth our time. It can be inner work that we do on our own. You talk about spiritual technologies and becoming
Yeah.
wise. You say, I like spiritual technologies, ways of focusing the energies of our hearts.
Yeah.
And these things like prayer and meditation and silence that help us become more centered, that sort of help us direct that, that the spiritual technologies that could help us then step into the spaces with the energy that we want to step into, the intention. What's your, I don't want to ask you what's your morning practice, because that sounds like an Instagram question, but it kind of is. Like,
Yeah.
what do you do to
Yeah.
strengthen your heart, the energies of your heart?
Yeah. I mean, across time, it's really, I've had a lot of different phases. And I guess, one thing somebody recently said to me, a friend said, I'm thinking about praying and I don't even really know how to begin. And so I'm going to send him some things, conversations or books. But the truth is, I think just asking the question, and I think I gave myself permission a long time ago, but I realized I was exposed to so much, and I kind of just want to give this permission to everyone to really be a spiritual adventurer in a way, in terms of what your grounding routines will be. And also, we change across time, and that will change. And so there have been times, I mean, there was a time, when I was, say, I I have a pretty expansive spiritual sensibility, compared to my Southern Baptist preacher grandfather. But on the other hand, that is my spiritual homeland and mother tongue, right? So I think I had a period of going far away from that, and coming back to Christianity with a lot of curiosity, but in a very different way from the way I was raised. And there was a time when I was reading the Compline service, which is an ancient kind of nighttime service in the Book of Common Prayer, right? But I was reading a Franciscan version of it, like I found this prayer book and I was doing that at night. And that was a time when I was actually, I don't know, I was raising my kids. I was pretty much single parenting. I was really stressed out from, very exhausted from work. Even though I had work I was grateful for, and that was a time when getting centered kind of at the end of the day was what I really needed, and there was a lot in those prayers in the Compline service about just being fearful and kind of getting grounded and knowing you would wake up in the morning and you would start all over again. And then I had a period of where I was just really meditating and kind of learning different meditation techniques. And, I checked out the different apps. I think this stuff is so personal. I grew up with prayer, but the prayer tradition that I grew up in was just free form. You're talking to God, you're just talking out into the universe, and it's whatever is on your heart and mind. And then later I would gravitated towards Anglican Episcopal tradition, which is common prayer. You pray together with other people and you say words, the same words that millions of other people have said, at other, and so, and I do think it's very personal what suits us, what is the right style of prayer and meditation for us. More recently, I did eventually start being, morning practice person. I think that for most people, that's what works best, to do it before the day begins. And even if it means just like carving out 5 or 10 minutes, which is, for years, what I mostly had. But I do also, I think as I've gotten older, I think if you are attending, I think even this language of saying, attending to the quality of your presence in the world, right? Which is not something I do perfectly or all the time. But that in itself is a spiritual discipline. And in a way, it's a form of prayer to me. It's like putting your body in the shape of something that is aspirational, that is, that is reaching for something more that I can be, that I can't be alone. I feel like my prayer, my meditation, as I grow older, I'm in my 60s now, and you do change, and this becomes more, it becomes more like body memory, this kind of living and praying at the same time. I don't know. So I feel like it's been an adventure, and what I really want to encourage people to do is take it on as an adventure.
Yeah, it's a lot like our relationship with movement, right? That it changes over the course of our lives. There'll be periods of our life where we're running marathons, or periods of our life where we're
Yes.
swimming, and and then some where we're doing yoga, but that we carry through that thread of tending to our bodies through movement, right? Or the
Yes,
joy of movement.
exactly.
The
And
same with
it's also
spirituality. Yeah.
true that some of us are made to like get out of bed in the morning and run a mile on our own, right? And some of us need a group, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
some of us do team sports, and some of us swim, and you have to find that activity, that form of being physically alive and moving that suits you. And I think that spiritual practice is the same way. And it's okay to go looking for that and trying things on. But then to take it seriously, not just dabble at some point, give it some depth and some time.
And some of that may include going back to your own
Yes.
spiritual ancestry that maybe you've set aside for different reasons. My dad was Buddhist growing up, but I went to Catholic school,
Yeah.
and there was at our Catholic school, there was this statue of Saint Francis with holding a bird in his hand. And I always loved Saint Francis because he was the like sort of the saint of the animals and peace. And
Yes.
we would say the prayer of Saint Francis in school. And I just revisited it, and it's such a Buddhist prayer. And it's
Right.
Christianity, right? Like
Right.
I think it's like, where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where
Yes.
there is
Yes.
darkness, light.
Yeah.
May I seek to be understood as to understand, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so the whole sort of practice of going back to that prayer or remembering Saint Francis feels very different than it did when I was in Catholic school. Now, having
Uh-huh.
done all these other, more contemplative practices, but it does feel good that you talked about the memory of your grandfather and coming from the Baptist church, right? Like it feels familiar in some way, and
Yeah,
that is
it
really
is a
comforting.
mother tongue.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. I remember once interviewing early on because I was often interviewing people about things that were present in my life. So when my children were younger, I did a lot of interviews about parenting. And I interviewed this wonderful rabbi who's done a lot of work with children and speaking to children about religious things. Her name was Sandy Sasso. And I remember, I was talking to her about this fact that many of us, well, a lot of people these days are not raised in a tradition. But I think people who are raised in a tradition, at some point you question that. It's a kind of a natural phase to question that. And then I think whether you came from a tradition or not in any strong way, when you have children of your own, you start wondering, what do I want to give my children? What kind of formation? What am I passing on to them? People ask questions that they've never asked before, perhaps about should we be attending services or this but then it can be very fraught because people are maybe more clear in what they reject than what they what they're drawn to. And I remember Sandy Sasso saying to me, like, don't let the people who represent the worst of your tradition define whether you decide to whether you might befriend or investigate your tradition again. Don't let them do that. There's probably something there that will feel like home, and that can be meaningful.
Mm. I love that. Don't let the people that represent the worst. And maybe you can
Sure.
redefine that tradition for yourself, for your
Yes.
family, and then let
Yes.
your children
Exactly.
define. I mean, that was the other thing. I grew up with it. My parents had a saying from the prophet on their wall. It was something about children. It would say, "Your children are not your children. They come through you, but not, they aren't you," right? And that idea of passing on these practices. I mean, certainly we pass on these practices to our boys, taking them to Plum Village, but there's no expectation, right, that they would have to follow that path. It's just a experimentation and adventure for them to try. Did you raise your children with spirituality? Was that something that was in your household that you
Well,
exposed them
so
to?
I was in a kind of unusual situation because their father and I divorced, and he was an Episcopal priest. So in a way, I had like a get out of jail free card because because I knew
Wow.
that he was going to give them this total formation, and so they got that from him, and then I just my work often had to do with interviewing and having conversations about this subject matter, but in a really expansive way. And so I think I don't, certainly, they were also aware that this was my work. So I didn't, it's not like I sat them down to give them a lesson about, I interviewed Thich Nhat Hanh this week and this is what you need to know. But I actually took my daughter along to that Thich Nhat Hanh retreat. Now she was only, 6 or 7. So she kind of has a memory of it. So I think I just kind of did what I do around them. I didn't force it down their throats, but I also let them see it.
Mhm.
And, they would hear snatches of things. And that's also a way that we have of, just we're in our own conversation and our own investigation and adventure. I think more of us, even if we're deeply planted in a tradition, I think this is true. for, it's a different time, and we read books and we listen to podcasts, right? And we have conversations about these things outside the bounds of a tradition. And I think just letting your children eavesdrop on that is a value to them.
Hmm. I love letting children eavesdrop and then let them like know when they're eavesdropping and plant a few
Yeah.
seeds, like talk
Yeah.
about them in really positive ways while they're eavesdropping, right? That
Yeah.
that they what seeds are you watering in them? But
Yeah.
that's beautiful that she got exposed in that way to some of these ideas, but not, shoved down her throat.
Yeah, but I think also the way religious formation works is not that it's things are internalized, but it also gives people something to question.
Hmm.
So I mean, it's like people who are growing up with no religious formation also they don't have anything to wrestle with
Right.
necessarily, or they find it maybe on their own, but it's not given to them. So it's not like when you give people a strong identity and a world of teachings and text and songs and rituals and all of that, you're also giving them something to chew on, and they will come to a time probably when they will set themselves over against it critically, and that's okay. I think that's actually partly what you're passing on.
Questions.
Yeah.
In your TED Talk, you had these three art of living. I guess there are recommendations or observations that you were
Yeah.
suggesting, and one of them was about sitting longer in the questions, which I love as a therapist because that's a place that I sit in with clients
Yeah.
quite a bit.
Yeah.
And but also the relief that comes from being able to be in the question itself, that we don't have to come to the answer so
Yeah.
quickly. And that's what makes us scramble and maybe trip over ourselves a bit,
Yeah.
is that we're trying to say the right thing really quickly.
Yeah.
And if we sit in the questions themselves, that it gives us a little bit more openness to
Yeah.
even come up collectively with some potentially down the road answers. But I'm curious what questions you're grappling with or sitting in or allowing to unfold
Oh,
right
right
now.
now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think uh, I'm wondering, I'm really working with this, what we're learning from the natural world. I'm really I see that the natural world knows how to be whole, and it knows, it has vitality and incredible capacities for repair and regeneration, and growth and beauty, and um it it and it without separation. um Now there's dying, and there's eating, and there's a circle of life, right? And all of it. It's not all it's complex, and yes, things get smaller and things die. And and that somehow is understood to be part of life. And when things nutrients are needed, nutrients shift where they're needed. And when things die, they are not lost, they are absorbed, and the lessons are learned. And so I feel like we've come to the end of this experiment we had of the last few hundred years, in particular, of living this ethic of separation and extraction, from the natural world and from each other. Um, and I feel like so much is breaking, and I also feel like so much has been breaking. And on the other side of that, there has to be a lot of space for creating. But uh, there are so many treacherous, sharp edges to this breaking, right? So it's like, how do we? I think this matter of where you and I started, of being present where you live, where you can be of service, is more urgent, is just more real.
Mhm.
in this particular moment. Like that is where you can be of service. And I also, how to be, how to do this, how to keep this creative and regenerative energy alive in ourselves. Again, where we live, what we do. I mean, I think like first grade teachers are some of the most creative people in our midst, right? I think most of us are working in institutions, the institutions that kind of came out of the 20th century that just don't make sense. And pandemic kind of accelerated that, but we're still working with medicine, which doesn't make sense, and schools, which don't make sense, and a justice system, which doesn't make sense. And yet all over the place, in every organization, in every government agency, whatever, you have people who are doing a new thing with these old forms. And so I think another question I have is how do we start to function more like an ecosystem and get visibility to the creativity and the regeneration that's happening over here and over there? How do we feel less alone, which is you know, another way to ask that question. And how do we like start learning, have shared learning, and be cross-pollinating? And also, I think seeing each other is going to be a source of hope. Um, so those are the questions I'm asking, but I think I have to ask them um, really close to my reality, right? Like in what I see and who I'm with today and tomorrow and the next day. And I think that's where any of us can kind of live this inquiry.
Mhm. Yes, and I'd add to those questions of how are we with things that are breaking,
How are we with things that are
right?
breaking?
How are we with grief? And
Yeah.
that first grade teacher, he, she, they are pretty
Yeah.
good with sitting with a kid that's crying, right? Or
Yes,
a
you're so
chaotic,
right.
messy space that's just like
So
falling
right.
apart and like staying
Yeah.
grounded and purpose driven on what am I going to get done today, and then how
Yeah.
am I going to pivot today based on the kid that's crying in the room. So there is that. We can turn to each other to see that, the resources that are already here, the resiliency that's already here. We can also look to nature because I mean, I look at nature and the beauty of nature, but nature is also gnarly. It's like
Yes.
cold and
Yes.
it's,
Yes.
my son surfs. It's big and it's
Yeah.
scary and it's
Yeah.
it's fires and it's
Yeah.
all those like the dramas of nature.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's those things with equanimity. It's those things with,
Yeah.
oh yeah,
Yes, with
this is
equanimity.
how it
Yeah.
is. This
Yeah.
is nature. This is how it is. The
Yeah.
nature of things. Things are
Yeah.
destroyed and things are
Yeah.
created. And there's
Yeah.
no drama, no personal, it's not personally
Yeah. Yeah.
taken. So I see those as the questions. Like, how am I with chaos? How do
And
I
I
stay
think
centered in
you
chaos?
bringing grief in is exactly right, because we have a lot to grieve, right? If things are dying, if things are breaking that look like the shape of what we knew, um, we need to be able to grieve, and we are bad at that in this culture. We don't do it. We don't do it communally. We don't give space for it. I mean, you do it. You help people do it in your profession. Um, we the ecological thing, we need to be grieving the way the weather is changing, right?
Mhm.
The fact that our planet is in disarray, and that equanimity is disturbed, right? So then we do get drama with weather field,
Mhm.
right? That it's
Mhm.
so we if and because we know in life, in a family, if you don't grieve, then that grief just shapes you, right? Then the grief is what you have, and you can't see beyond it. And so there's, again, like, this might sound like private work, but I think for our collective health, if we don't get better, if we don't find ways to like grieve, and then, because we won't heal out of grief, we will heal out of the love that is on the other side of that grief. And that's again where the joy comes in. Like, we're gonna want to throw our lives behind saving our beautiful world because we do love it. But we can't always touch into that so deeply as energizing if we're just filled with sadness and fear about its future.
Yeah.
It's such a complex balancing act that we're called to. And I mean, boy, do we need each other and all the helpers and tools that we can find, right?
Yeah. And I think what grief offers us is sort of two things. It gives us permission to slow down and actually forces us to slow down. When people are grieving, they get really heavy and slow. And and then they also, when we're grieving, think about if you've grieved someone that you've lost, you may take out their picture and look at them. You may be reminded of them, as you drive by some place that reminds you of the time you spent together. So it brings back this remembering of what you
Right,
love. And if we do
right.
that with our ecological grief, that could be great benefit to nature itself, right? To slow way down and to
Yeah.
remember that we love this. Then we may
Right.
treat it differently, or we may, just interact with it in a different way. I was at this was just like 9 days after the election, and I was at this gathering, and Alyssa Epple was there. It was like, she's doing all this incredible climate stuff, and Jack
Yeah.
Kornfield and Trudy Goodman and Dan Siegel. And we were sitting at a table when the news kind of came in about all the things that were it was like that day when everything got cut,
Yeah.
and and we were kind of like, just didn't know what to say. And all we could do was just at the table, we all held hands like in this little circle and just silent of like, we don't know what to do. And these are like the people that know what to do, right? That
Yeah.
that it was a moment of grief of like, can we just hold hands here? Like almost like a vigil,
Yeah.
holding hands for the loss
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
But it felt really powerful in the same
Yeah.
way. It felt like, so we can hold hands, with our small communities, with nature across the globe. And I've just appreciated this hour with you, getting to know you and what's on your mind and how
Oh,
you're
thank you.
navigating
I
all this.
really love that image you just gave me. I mean, if what if next time something, whatever news comes down, we could just have clasp the hands of 6 people. You know what I mean? Like that
Yeah.
would be a really good first reaction for that. That would then probably lead to better second and third and fourth reactions.
Yes. I think we need to bring back hand holding all around. Hand holding at our
And
dinner table. I mean, that's
well,
for many of us, that's part of our traditions, right? Hand holding at the dinner
yeah,
table, hand holding
yeah.
in a crisis. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Hmm.
also pausing, right? I mean, I hear
Hmm.
you. I'm like just seeing it. I'm seeing you all looked up. You look into each other's eyes. You didn't start railing or opining, right? That
Hmm.
you took a reverent pause before the gravity of reality and you comforted each other, and that made you all stronger for standing up from that table.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sat in the question of it. We don't
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
We don't
Yeah.
know what's going to
Oh,
happen. Yeah.
I really enjoyed this too. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista.
Yeah. Wow. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Wise Effort podcast. Wise Effort is about you taking your energy and putting it in the places that matter most to you. And when you do so, you'll get to savor the good of your life along the way.